Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Forum. This is the first Forum of 2025, so Happy New Year, and we're looking forward to seeing a lot of you back here for coming programs. Our speaker today is Michael Epstein. I'll give a complete introduction of him shortly, but he's going to talk about our neighboring district, the Fillmore, also known as the Western Addition, and the very rich cultural history there of Black culture, and also the somewhat less or sad history of redevelopment and how that impacted the folks there. Some other talks we have coming up, like next Sunday, we will have David Bacon, who's going to be speaking about immigration and what we can expect under the Trump administration, which is about to take office. The week after that, Norm Solomon will be here speaking about militarism and imperialism and foreign policy issues and things like that. Also on the 26th, after church, in this room, we'll be having a special meeting for the Human Rights Working Group to explain about the apartheid-free congregations pledge that we're hoping the congregation will vote and pass on the 2nd of February. So we have some interesting speakers for you here for that meeting after church on the 26th. And on the 2nd of February, we will have Billy Avery from the Gainesville Women's Center speaking about reproductive rights. So that's the upcoming forums that we have for you over the next month or so. On the table, as you enter, there's a couple of sign-up sheets. If you're not already receiving our mailings announcing these forum sessions, you can sign up for those. That's the forum sign-up list. And then the Human Rights Working Group is a similar but different mailing list that we use to notify people about things that are of interest to the human rights community. In case you're new here at the church, the bathroom is just around the corner over there. Of course, the breakfast is there. And what else? We have Q&A at the end. That's the way we typically run these sessions, is if you have questions, please jot them down on the cards that you'll find on each table and on the chairs. And then at the end of the meeting, which will be at around 15 or 20 after 10, John Meliska will handle the Q&A. We'll take the cards and we'll ask the questions from the microphone up here. We do that rather than having folks ask the questions themselves. Hope that's okay. And before I introduce Michael, Dolores will be giving our Ohlone land recognition.
We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the ancestral custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that our society rests upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We recognize that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone and other indigenous peoples have understood the interconnectedness of all life and maintained harmony with all of nature for millennia. We honor and thank them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth.
Thank you, Dolores. We really do honor our Ohlone landowners. Now I'd like to introduce Michael Epstein. He's a journalist specializing in media that gets audiences moving. He has directed, written, and produced over 20 documentary, theater, immersive audio, and new media projects that invite the exploration of critical places. He is the founder of the SF-based interactive studio called Walking Cinema, and he is an adjunct faculty at the California College of Arts. And I learned about him reading a review of a play called The Fillmore Eclipse, which really, I missed seeing it myself. I hope it comes back. I believe he'll talk about that a little bit in his talk today. It looks amazing, and of course it's about our neighborhood next to us here, the Fillmore. So with that, I'd like to introduce Michael Epstein.
Good morning, everybody. Wanted to thank Jeff and Dolores and other members of the church for making this possible. I've never been in this building. So I'm really surprised, and it's so pleasant in here. So I appreciate you all inviting me in. I also appreciate Dolores's land recognition statement because I am right now totally immersed in a project about an Ohlone village that was in, what we now call the Presidio for 2 millennia. And we are working on an audio and augmented reality walk of that village, where you'll be able to sort of see where it was, but also understand a lot of those ideas that were in the land acknowledgement statement about how we are, or how we might be, caretakers, for land, not necessarily extracting, not necessarily seeing land as something to be acquired, but as something that we can live in harmony with. And if we take care of it, can last in balance with us. I think that's actually a good introduction to what I'm going to talk about today, which is Fillmore history. It's a neighborhood that's also called the Western Addition. It's an area that you could say has gone through a number of identity shifts, but I'm going to focus on shifts in the mid-20th century, as it was known as the Harlem of the West at that time, and housed a really thriving music and art scene, mostly from African Americans, but also included Japanese Americans, Jewish, and all types of folks, because this was also a big site for people in the military who were passing through this city. And so, it was a neighborhood that hosted a lot of, different kinds of folks. I want to go back to my history a little bit first, to 2017. And I actually got what I thought was one of the best jobs of my life. I was sent to Rome, Italy, to work for a year with a team of producers creating a series of audio walks in Rome for a company called Detour that was and still is based in San Francisco. And I was like, this is great. I get to spend a year in Rome. I get to explore, the city with fascinating people and work with this new technology. At the time, they were thinking, hey, we all carry these devices in our pockets. Maybe there's a way that these phones can become like the ultimate tour guide, taking you to the coolest places in town. You put on some headphones, you use GPS so it knows exactly where you are, and you get these beautifully, perfectly timed walks through any city in the world that you want to visit. And in fact, it was a really fantastic experience. I got to work with, you can see in like the top row there's a great filmmaker, Vittorio Storaro, who worked on Apocalypse Now. He led one of the walks, a food tour, Roman hip hop tour. I worked on 8 different projects, all of them fascinating in this beautiful city. But there was something about it when I came back home here in 2017 where I was like, there was something missing from that experience. And I think what was missing for me is that a lot of it was, you could say, extractive, going back to what Dolores was talking about with like land acknowledgements and our relationship to the land. It was sort of like, take me on a food tour, let me sort of extract the best tastes and flavors from this city. Let me extract interesting tidbits of knowledge that other people don't know that I can share at a cocktail conversation. And for a while in my mind, I've been thinking about this idea of what I call dynamic citizens, right? That potentially visitors to a city aren't just there to get stuff and take selfies and have a good time and show their friends how great their life is. That even for like a few hours while they're in a city, they could actually act as citizens. And I call them dynamic citizens. The first place that I started thinking about this idea of dynamic citizens was in Venice, Italy. And that's a place that sees 25 million tourists a year. It has a population of 60,000 people. So you can imagine at any given moment in Venice, Italy, most people are not from there. And I was thinking about ways that you could provide programming that would activate these people to become responsible citizens. And that was sort of what was missing for me from this experience in Rome. And so I started thinking about, could we make these walks less about some really interesting person just guiding you through a neighborhood and make it more like a documentary film? one that challenges your assumption, one that gets you to think about a topic in a totally different way. But instead of sitting in a room looking at a screen, you're actually walking through the place of the movie. And so that's where I started getting really excited about audio walks. But this, I was more in the documentary mindset. I also thought, for me, what also makes a film good is there's some controversy, and I'm sure, from what I know, the little bit I know of this church, you all are not afraid of controversies. Is that right? I mean, I drive by and I see people outside talking about immigration policy. You're not afraid to stand up and say something that may not be the most popular idea. And I do think that there's travelers and families and people who visit cities that want that same experience of challenge me, give me something difficult to think about. And then finally, I thought about this idea that, in Rome, we covered a lot of the main tourist attractions, but could this technology be used to get people off the beaten path more? With the GPS and the geolocated capabilities, could it really, drive people into new areas? And so I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2017 to look at the history of housing in San Francisco using this new format, this audio walk format. And I started looking into this guy. Does anybody in the audience recognize? Go ahead and shout out his name if you know who this is. Anybody recognize him? I'll give a hint. Until about 2020, he had a plaza named after him. Yes, thank you. Who was that? Okay, there. Thank you. Do you want to say anything about? Let's make this a little interactive. Anything you want to say about him? What comes to mind when you think of Justin Herman? Exactly. And for folks who don't know who Robert Moses was, he was this planning czar, in New York City. He's the one who said, let's build highways, right through Greenwich Village. Let's make transportation and the modernization of cities the top priority. And this guy in the 1950s brought a similar tableau to San Francisco. And he's very maligned now, but when I started researching him, I'm like, he did some great things in Diamond Heights. He took areas where there weren't people, and he did a lot to build low-income housing and also churches. He built quite a few religious sites up there, too. But the thing he did in the Fillmore that was just horrendous is he said, we're going to have to level this neighborhood, which was mostly African-American. And a lot of cities were doing this at the time, by the way. This was happening in D.C. This was happening in Chicago. It was the idea of you clear a neighborhood, you come in with a big federal grant, you rebuild it, people move back in. That was the promise. It didn't play out that way. And so I started developing a story about him. And one of my advisors said, it's kind of difficult to do a story about a white guy when you really want to profile an African-American neighborhood. And I sort of thought about that, and I was like, you're right. It was also very, his name was already coming up as controversial. This is 3 years before the supervisors voted to take his name off Embarcadero Plaza. And then I discovered this guy, which is even more obscure. I doubt anybody in the neighborhood knows this guy, but he did grow up in the Fillmore. His name is Wilbur Hamilton. He died, I think, 3 years ago. But he had a background of being one of the first African-American families in the neighborhood. His dad was out in San Antonio in the 1930s and got a vision, a religious vision, to come to San Francisco and preach. And so he grew up here in the Fillmore before there was a big African-American influx in the 40s and 50s. And the way I came across his name is that Justin Herman was getting so much pushback about his plan in the neighborhood at community meetings. And Wilbur Hamilton stood up one day and said, you don't understand our community, you don't understand our needs. You're going to destroy what is the preeminent African-American culture on the West Coast. And Justin Herman said to him, well, you think you know what to do here? I'll hire you on the spot. So he hired Wilbur Hamilton to be the administrator for project areas A1 and A2. We're in project area A2, which was about 40 city blocks. Project area A1 is across Geary Boulevard. That was about 20 city blocks. And he started being, the manager of the project. And I found his situation really interesting. You know, one of these people who is both trying to work with the powers that be, the city government, and at the same time trying to save his community. And neither one of them went very well for him. But that's what I think makes a good documentary film, is somebody who is trying to do something very difficult. And I'll show you what we ended up coming up with. We basically decided we were going to do about a 1-hour experience. It's a mile walk, starting up at your neighbor church, St. Mary's Cathedral, just up on the hill, and then it ends up in the Fillmore Center. And so one of the key ideas I had is like, who's going to tell this story? You know, are we going to do a documentary film where we just sort of interview people who remember the history and we put those voices in, which is typically what you do in a documentary. But I got the idea that after I interviewed a lot of people who had lived through the time period, I wanted to work with young African-American poets to tell the story. So using those interviews, these poets revoiced the story in kind of their own words. And I'll just play a trailer for the project.
San Francisco is currently known for its housing crunch and its astronomical rents, but it's actually a city with a long and storied history of creating affordable housing. In the 1960s, San Francisco was a testbed for the concept of total housing, massively clearing out and rebuilding neighborhoods all at once. In the mostly black Fillmore District, 30,000 people were displaced and 2,400 Victorian homes were flattened. It was controversial, sad, and embattled.
It means Negro removal. That is what it means.
The Museum of the Hidden City is a new kind of museum. It lets you live urban history in the places where it all happened. The museum's exhibits are all around you, brought to life through immersive audio, augmented reality, and the fabric of the city. Young poets tell the stories of two people on the front lines of urban renewal. A preacher's daughter trying to understand the larger plan.
I mean, here I can touch the pieces of the church. I can see our history and reminisce, but this feels more apocalyptic, more Book of Revelations than salvation.
These murals hang here, still beautiful, still strong, now lifeless, lonely and longing.
And an architect trying to build to the rhythm of a neighborhood.
There was no stiff formality to these buildings before. Just inviting entrances, open windows and doors, every entrance syncopated to the beat of a song all of our hearts knew. And the music coursed and flowed through every body and every building.
Now head to the ramp on your right that leads to the pedestrian bridge. But as that pagoda was going up, Daddy was negotiating the destruction of another religious building. His father's church, my grandfather's church. My father stands in unity, says no, says this is ours, uses his voice to dispel the injustice, and again we cheer.
Dynasties, utopias, and a new sense of housing justice come to life. So grab your smartphone, walking shoes, and download the free app by searching for Museum of the Hidden City in the app stores. It's running September 1st to January 1st. Don't miss it.
Okay, just a spoiler, it's still running. We only thought it would run for 6 months or a year, and it's now been running for 5 years. And that's a testament to a lot of partnerships we formed where they were like, keep telling this story, you know, and that's what's so fantastic about this format, is that unlike doing something in a museum where you have to move out an exhibit and bring in new ones, because it exists sort of a layer on top of the city, it can keep going. It ended up winning a Gold Muse Award, which is the highest award that's given out by the American Alliance of Museums. And as I said, it's still running today. You can go to our website and or just search on the internet for Museum of the Hidden City and download the free app. Again, it takes about an hour to walk it. So this project was really important, first of all, in that it got me to really love this neighborhood. I met so many great people who said, go for it, and wanted to share this difficult history, but also celebrated the idea that we were doing something different. So we had, as you might have seen in the video, shops that hosted artifacts. We had a blues and music venue host a whole map of the neighborhood that triggered an augmented reality experience. And then we found those beautiful murals in an office building on Fillmore Street. They had been forgotten. And if you might have caught it in the trailer, the whole kind of central story of this walk is that Wilbur Hamilton, in this process of trying to help redevelopment happen in an ethical way in his neighborhood, had to tear down his father's church and had to break the news to his father, you're no longer going to have this building, this magnificent building that you built when I was a baby. When you came here, your whole vision, I'm going to have to basically move you to a new building. But it was not where he wanted. And as you might have noticed, there were 14 murals on the walls of that church, on his father's church, each depicting a different station of the cross. And they were painted by a local artist, Aaron Miller, in 1950. And 2 of them were saved. And it took us the longest time to figure out if they still existed, where they were. And we found them in this sort of nondescript lobby on Fillmore Street, and that's part of the tour. So, sort of salvaging some of this history. But, what I realized in doing this is it's all very current. We're still looking at displacement. We're still trying to struggle to figure out what happened to the African American identity of the city, who belongs here, who gets housing, how we build housing, how fast we can build housing so we don't lose people. And in that project, one of the things that came up was that Wilbur had lost his faith at a certain point in this whole battle to keep his community together. And his daughter told me that he became backslidden. Has anybody heard that term before? You have. Yeah, I didn't know what it meant. What does it mean? Yeah, he was saved, and then he lost his faith, and he became backslidden. And I said, well, what happened in that period where he lost his faith? And they said, he was going to Jimbo's a lot. And I was like, what's Jimbo's? And he said, Jimbo's Bop City. It was this small jazz club in the basement level of Victorian on Post Street. And all the big names came there. Sammy Davis Jr., John Coltrane played there. And I said, tell me more about this Bop City. And that became the next project that we did. And so this is, I guess, really how Jeff discovered me, is in the spring of last year of 2024, for about 5 weeks, we ran an immersive theater show. It was in the lower level of Victorian. It was at Fillmore and Sutter Street in a studio called Honey Art Studio, which was started by an African-American woman who grew up in the neighborhood and wanted to give kids more artistic and productive activities that they could do in the neighborhood. So she started a Honey Art Studio. And I came to her. I saw that she had on her walls all these photos of the Harlem of the West. A lot of them were Bop City. And I said, hey, I've got this immersive theater idea. Could we produce it here? And she opened her doors, and we ran this show again for 5 weeks. And it really did well. And it sold out pretty much every performance. As you can see, we had a live band. We had actors, basically, who were characters from the time period based on real people, but they intermingled with the audience. That's what the idea of immersive is they're not just standing on a stage. They'd sit down to you. They'd share stories with you. They'd share, pictures of things that happened to them. One of them was a Jewish record shop owner who'd come around with different albums and tell you what he loved. But the story was really of what these 5 characters in a Bop City-like venue on the night before it closes down, because redevelopment bulldozers are about to come in, and they're sort of debating, what does this mean? Is it a new start? Is it an end? Is it going to be equitable? Is it not? And so, for me, creatively, it was a chance to have a physical venue instead of sort of being a layer on top of the city. We were in an address that was really fun for me, especially from the perspective of designing a space. but also created really strong connections to the neighborhood. And just having people coming in and out, they'd walk by and they'd see what we were doing in there. They'd knock on the door, they'd come in. And so I got a lot closer to the neighborhood by doing this. I'll play a little trailer for what the experience was like.
To the Eclipse!
It's the last night.
But there's work to be done to save our Fillmore, you hear me? Our Fillmore! They can tear down some buildings, but not our neighborhood.
What happens here is more than music, because what happens here is something that gets down into your soul.
You think them damn certificates gonna save the Fillmore?
You're not the mayor of the Fillmore Street. You're the master's overseer.
We are a part of this community.
Y'all enjoy yourself.
Don't let anyone fool you. The city's not investing in the Fillmore. The city is trying to move black people out of the Fillmore.
The night is young. Good job.
It really leads me to like the Q&A section, which I really relish. Just to update on the Fillmore Eclipse, we've applied for a number of grants to try to remount it this spring, and we're still waiting. The grant environment for the arts is really challenging right now. In fact, 2 organizations that had supported the initial iteration of this did not decide to continue supporting it. We still have, I think, 2 more grants that we're waiting to hear back on to see if we can remount it in the spring. But I'd welcome anybody online or anybody here who has suggestions about grant or donor opportunities to remount it. Basically, we need about $50,000 to set up the venue, to pay the actors, the creative, build the set, that kind of thing, and do a remount. Our target is late spring. But I welcome Q&A now. This is my favorite part.
Question here says, how did the city get rights to the land?
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, so it's very similar to what they did for highways, where they had eminent domain. You might have heard of that term before, eminent domain. It basically says, like, if there is a project for the public good that is being blocked by private property, the government, the federal government, has the right to come in and basically take that property. They're supposed to pay the owners of the houses, but it's what built our federal highway system, was eminent domain. And then that same mechanism became very popular in the 1950s to do this kind of urban clearing and redevelopment process. And so people were, basically kicked out of their homes for the greater public good. And in this case, it was to what they said, get rid of a slum. Oh, we have this slum in the middle of our city. Look, it's got higher crime. It's got higher disease levels. It's, the buildings are in bad shape. We should use eminent domain, clean it up. And what they promise to people is it'll just take a few years, move you out, and then you'll come back into these new sparkling developments, which is what happened to London Breed's family. She grew up in those same projects that were built based on redevelopment. But instead of taking 4 years, it took 40 years for them to finish the project. So yeah, it's a mechanism, but it didn't really work that well. One thing that's interesting is that part of that program required the government to show blight. So in the 1940s, if you circled in this neighborhood, you'd see fire marshals going in and out of people's houses. And what they're doing is trying to see, were there any hazards, fire hazards? Was there over too many people living in a building? Which you can imagine in an immigrant or a low-income community, there's a lot of people tend to live in housing that might be made for 2 or 3 people. So they've cited all these violations. And one of them, if you look back at the blight conditions, were a concentration of minorities. So a neighborhood, even having too many black folks in it, was considered blighted, and that could qualify it to be redeveloped.
Can you tell us more about the Victorian buildings that were destroyed?
Oh, man. Well, maybe what's interesting, too, I don't know if you've done this, but sometimes you go down around the city and you'll see a row of Victorians that look really out of place. Like, what are they doing among, these other buildings that are more modern, or why are they sort of at a different angle than the other houses around them? So part of what was happening in the 50s and 60s is they were saving some Victorians. They were actually picking them up and moving them to other parts of the city so they wouldn't be torn down. And that was due to like the value of these houses. They were so beautiful. But it also had to do with what I discovered as like a mini rebellion in Justin Herman's office, where people knew he was destroying this incredible housing structure. And so, unbeknownst to him, they started declaring certain buildings historic landmarks. And so they had to be saved by this program. The other thing that I heard about these Victorians, I mean, just to make you, I think the question is like, why did they do this horrible things to these great buildings? They were great buildings. They were really, really great buildings. Some of the African-American elders I interviewed said things like, a Victorian had this incredible structure where, a lot of them had that like back porch area kind of behind the kitchen. They said that's where the grandparents would live. That was grandparents' zone, the back area. And so with these flats, it had this wonderful structure for multi-generational living where grandparents could be back, the family would sort of be in the main area. And a lot of them had these kind of basements or lower levels that were sort of unfurnished, but the kids could play down there. So the very structure of the Victorian was really ideal for African-American families. They tried to replicate it in some of the new housing that they brought in. They liked it so much. And the last thing I'll say is one guy who was part of redevelopment, like bulldozing operation, told me that to knock down these Victorians was incredibly hard. That they had a type of redwood posts that went in to create the foundations that were 3x8s. You don't see them anymore. They're incredibly thick. And just to get those down was incredibly hard. So they were very well built. The same guy said in the 80s when they had to knock down some of the buildings that they put in the 70s, some of the redevelopment buildings that were shoddily built, like the bulldozer would touch it and it would fall down. So you were looking at these they were both flexible for earthquakes, but also solid. They could stand up for years. So it's really too bad that 2,400, I think, were taken out of the neighborhood.
Longshoreman in St. Francis Square, Leroy King.
Yeah, that's part of the tour, actually. So that, I don't know what the question is, really, but that's a really interesting part. I'll try to be short with it. That was a success for Justin Herman. He formed a partnership with the Longshoremen's Union to build a co-op in the middle of the Fillmore. And it was, for union workers mostly. It was middle to low income housing. It was a co-op model. It was doing what Herman thought he would do for the rest of the neighborhood. This is like the first, I think, moderate income housing that the redevelopment agency built in San Francisco, and it looked really successful. It's still there. You can still walk through it. I don't know much about Leroy, so I'm going to have to balk on that, but I do know that there was a partnership there that really seemed to work and made people optimistic about what was going to come. The problem with that particular development and with the whole plan that they brought into Fillmore was they thought to keep people safe and clean, you had to take corner stores, you had to take commerce, you had to like push it all to one side of the neighborhood and say, that'll be the commercial district. And what they didn't understand is that having a corner store creates conversation. People come to the store, they stop, they see their friends, they can go in and out, and so that mix of commerce and residential created this liveliness in the Fillmore that got completely lost in like Harbor Square apartments.
With the Webster Safeway closing, are you aware of what will happen in that space next? Is there a way to create a space to celebrate the Black history and culture of our city there?
Oh, man. No, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that it's a very difficult proposition to try to saddle a city or a community with running a grocery store. Like, I think that's what they've been saying is like, we've got to somehow save a grocery store and run a grocery store. And that's a sort of public-private partnership that I don't know how that would work. I don't really know how, and from what I've seen with housing, I don't think the city would do a great job of trying to run a grocery store to lock it into a neighborhood. So I don't know a good solution to that. And I do know that it would become definitely like a food desert. And what I was just talking about, like the importance of commerce, would be a huge loss to the neighborhood. So the people who are protesting it, I think, are right that the neighborhood needs it. But I don't know how to solve that. And I don't think a public-private partnership is going to be able to run a grocery store. What I do know is that there has been talk in that very area for 70 years about giving the African American community something like the Japantown Mall. It was promised and it was designed in the 1960s. It was basically like a black mall. And the reason it didn't get built is partly Justin Herman died, but also that the group of African American builders that wanted to help build it got denied loans. They couldn't get loans to build it. And so the reason we have the Japantown Mall is partly because Justin Herman was a Japanophile. He loved Japan. And he saw it as, this huge link to the whole commerce, the trade that was coming out of Japan. And so again, his mind was very economic. He's like, if I build this Japantown Mall, we're going to get favorable trade agreements with Japan. And it did kind of happen. There was a Datsun showroom in the original Japantown Mall. There was a lot of products that were sort of being sold there. And that wasn't really, and I think that didn't seem available to build a black mall, that kind of commerce. So I think that's why it got killed. But yes, that's a great question, and it's very current, and it touches upon these like very, very deep-seated problems that we've had for decades.
Can you share more about your Alone project in the Presidio?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so we got a very generous grant from the National Endowment for Humanities. And if you guys want to start protesting another thing, Trump might try to close down the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Those might be on like him and his on his checklist of closing things down. But we got a $400,000 grant to really develop this format because the National Endowment really believes in this audio and augmented reality walk format. They really like what we did in the Fillmore. And that walk will, it's going to be a story about a school group that comes there, like a 5th grade school group that comes there and is sort of getting, I don't know if you've seen these, but there are places now that are developing recreations of Native American villages. They look like you're in a video game, but you can walk through like a park or a place like that and you can say, oh, that's what the hut looked like. That's where, the fishing nets were. Well, in this story, what we want to do is go deeper than just recreating what a village looked like. We want to really show how these people understood place, understood a connection to nature that was not degenerative, where they knew the seasons for doing certain things. They weren't just, they didn't see housing as just this roof that you put over your head. They saw it as a relationship with all of the plants and all of the animals and the seasons that were around them. And that's what I want to try to bring to life through this augmented reality experience. So again, it'll be about a 45-minute experience. It'll be in the Tunnel Tops area. It should launch this coming summer 2025. So go to walkingcinema.org and you'll get more information on it there.
Speaking of which, how do we keep in touch with you about future events?
Okay, my contact information is up here. But on our website, walkingcinema.org, there is a connect button, connect with us. And that will allow you to sign up for our newsletter, which is maybe quarterly, maybe 2 times a year. It's not that often. And also, if you want to just reach out to me that way through that contact form with any specific questions or projects, I personally will get back to you if you fill out that form.
At the beginning of your presentation, you talked with us about how we treat land and different attitudes toward land.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us about Henry George and how he believed land should be taxed or not taxed, and what should be the economic relationship we have to land?
I can't. I don't know who Henry George is.
Henry George is fascinating. Go to YouTube like I did, and there's a lot of really cool documentaries about Henry George and Georgism.
Okay, I have a research. I have a homework project now.
Can you tell us about the development of historic districts?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think there's two ways to answer that. There are historic districts, and then there are cultural districts. In San Francisco is sort of very advanced in this idea of cultural districts. You know, like there's the Latino 24th Street Corridor Cultural District. There's now an Ohlone Cultural District. And the idea is that the city is sort of giving funding for activities that sort of place make and place keep on those sites. Some of it could just be signage around the neighborhood, but I think some of it can also be these forms of media, media experiences that really hold on to this idea of placemaking and placekeeping. Historic districts, I think, is much more common, is a mechanism to sort of lock in neighborhoods and make sure that, in fact, Robert, who's in the audience, has, told me about having a historic home and the restrictions on that. It sort of like keeps a look and a feel going. But cultural districts are a little bit more advanced, sort of thinking like, what's the whole makeup, the commerce, the programming, the even like what's sold at stores is thought about in cultural districts. And I guess that's again, like goes back to the Safeway conversation, is like, how far do we want our government to reach into who can sell what where? I agree, like it would really be bad if there was no Latino food left in the Mission. I hope it doesn't happen. But you've seen things like people who are in charge of these cultural districts saying we shouldn't have stores that sell $200 handbags in this cultural district. And I think that's up for debate, because one is it sort of says, does that mean Latino people who grew up in the neighborhood shouldn't be able to buy $200 handbags? Does that program what they're able to buy? And it's the same with a Safeway. Whatever comes in there next, who decides? Should it be something that the government insists has to be here, or do we sort of allow the market to figure out what gets put in? And so I think there's a lot of tensions in those decisions. Yeah.
Can you talk about the history of Yoshi's and why it remains closed?
Oh, man. Yeah. So from what I understand, just to let people know, there is the Fillmore Cultural Center or Heritage Center is on Fillmore Street, kind of near the Panda restaurant there. And for a number of years, there was a Yoshi's Jazz Club in there. And there was also Risala's, which was run by an Ethiopian man. His widow now runs another jazz club across the street. But anyway, it was a black jazz club. From what I understand, they built that center as mixed use, meaning that it would have programming for museum, restaurants, and this club on the street level, and then up above it you had apartments. And specifically, they went after an African-American builder. They didn't know who it was going to be, but it was partly in retribution for what they did with the Black Mall that never got built, where Black developers couldn't get a loan. They're like, we want to make sure a Black developer can do this. And so they hired somebody who had never done mixed use and had never done anything on that scale, but who was African-American, was from Oakland, and the building costs got way out of hand. And that basically set a trigger in Yoshi's rent clause that said, your rent is X for 5 years, but after 5 years, there's going to be a jump to cover our costs. And the jump was way too much for Yoshi's to handle. And so they booked, and the builders went bankrupt, and the whole deal is the cities had to bail them out. And now the cities had an RFP for 5 years to try to fill that space. And it's turned into potentially the first site of reparations, African-American reparations, possibly being given as a place to the Black community. But it's also a sign that it's taken 5 years for the city to even respond or even finalize its RFP. It just shows you that like the city's ability to administer any of this is pathetic. And that's why I say like them taking over any kind of new supermarket at the Safeway is probably not going to work.
In East Bay, between Berkeley and Oakland, there is a corridor of 4 to 6 story buildings, supposedly about to be built for housing. Is this an example of eminent domain, how eminent domain is used?
I guess you could say it's like eminent domain for airspace, but upscaling, basically like allowing neighborhoods to change their zoning laws so you can build taller buildings is not really eminent domain. It is, more the idea that there's a really good book on this. I can't remember the name of it. Randy Shaw recommended it. He's also really involved in local housing. But basically, what's hard, I think, for that zone and for San Francisco is this idea that single family homes should have precedence, right? That this is a city where if you got your Victorian, you got your house in the sunset, you got, like nobody should block your view. It's like classic NIMBYism. And we're sort of reaching a crossroads where it's like, unless we want to be a city of total haves and total have-nots, with no middle class, we've got to find a way to take this 7 by 7 mile little, city and build up. And that's the only way that we're going to get more affordable housing here. And that's, of course, going to take away views. It's going to create more congestion. It'll create parking, like all these cascading issues. So I don't necessarily see it as the government, like they did with eminent domain, saying like, I'm going to grab your space and take it away. It's more like a city just deciding what its identity is going to be, because there's no way we're going to build affordable housing unless we either build up or we build into the bay.
Could you talk about Marcus Books and its story?
Oh my God, yeah. So Marcus Books, I think, was the first African-American bookstore west of the Mississippi. And what's crazy is, remember I talked about buildings being moved, like to save Victorians? So one of the Victorians they saved was the Victorian where Jimbo's Bop City was in sort of the basement. And they just moved it around the corner. And Jimbo's failed. It didn't survive not just redevelopment where everybody was cleared out, but also like jazz was not cool anymore in the 60s. So that they moved out. And guess who moved in? Marcus Books. So Marcus Books moved into the Jimbo's slot in the lower level of this Victorian. And they were there for a number of years. And then they moved to Oakland. And then they had a presence, which I think is still happening, at the African American Arts and Cultural Center. Which is right here on Fulton Street, I think. Yeah, I kept hearing they were moving in there, and now they weren't. I'm not sure. But they might be moving back into the neighborhood, at least, to be in that cultural center, which also, ironically, was the redevelopment offices. And when redevelopment said, hey, we're not going to build you your black mall, but we will give you this building that was our offices once we're done in the neighborhood. So that was sort of like supposed to be the cultural center, but it's nothing like the Japantown Mall. It doesn't have commerce. It's not as big. It's not as in like a foot trafficked area. So all these buildings have interesting connections between them. Yeah.
This person writes, David Geeson would be a good one to talk to Unitarian Universalist Forum about Henry George and the Commons. So I guess there's no question here. Well, how about this? Michael, would you come back to Forum and hear from David Geeson about Henry George?
After
Great.
I've done my Henry George homework. Yeah,
All right.
I'll definitely do that.
Did Willie Brown do anything to improve the Fillmore? Like he put a beautiful gold-painted dome on City Hall.
Oh, my God. It's a gap for me. I'm not even going to step. I don't know that history. I know kind of what's going on now, and I know like the 30s through up to the 80s, but I don't really know what Willie did. Sorry.
Do you think the new mayor, Lurie, will help the Fillmore and other areas build new units by simplifying the bureaucratic system?
I mean, I think so. I think it's good news. And I wouldn't say he'll do it. I mean, there's already been a state mandate for San Francisco and all cities to build a certain amount of affordable housing that Mayor Breed claims has shrinked wait times from like 10 years down to 2 years. So Lurie might get the visibility of that implementation, but it wasn't him. It started a long time ago. He might bring, I think, a knowledge of building affordable housing and the connections and probably a well-run operation, I'm optimistic, to get more done. I mean, we do have a state mandate by 2030, and we are way off course for that. So, he's he's in for the next 4 years. He's got to get pretty close to that mandate, and so we'll see where he gets to.
Next person asks, how much time is left? And it looks
I know that
like,
person.
It looks like we've got 8 more minutes.
8 more minutes.
If they wanted to ask a question, they'd be welcome to.
Do you have a question, Francesca? That's my son. He likes to keep track of time.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Zoom. Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Let's go to Zoom.
Yeah.
He didn't ask a question. He said no. Robert, do you have a question? Robert does not have a
land
question.
management is important. Time management is important. So it looks like we do have another question here. Is there a chance that a jazz club might get started?
Well, jazz clubs are interesting. There's been a number that have started recently, like Mr. Tipples, which is at Van Ness and Market, is still going strong. The Black Cat survived the pandemic. That's also in the Tenderloin. There is a new, I think it's called Music City, which is a new performance space that does jazz and popular music, which is down near, it's close to here. I forgot the name of the street. Anyway, there's a number of jazz clubs that are getting picked up and are happening. I think the city still supports jazz music, and it's still happening. I would say, though, for my project, our goal is to, we'll put it this way. When we worked at Honey Art Studio, we built a stage for them. We put in extra lighting. We put in a sound system. So in a way, they got retrofitted to have live music. They didn't fulfill with the programming, but I do believe that there is a gap in finding small jazz spaces, kind of like Bop City was, where it's small footprint, audience of maybe 20 people, 30 people can fit in there, but just does intimate jazz moments and drinks. I think SF Jazz Center is trying to do that with its like downstairs room, but it's still too, nice. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where we had a lot of blues joints where you just say hi to the owner when you'd walk in, and he'd cook for you and he'd play a few numbers on stage, like that kind of level of I still think there's a gap for something like that, to do something very small and informal, and I hope it happens.
The Jazz Center and the Fillmore, are they helping?
Yeah. I mean, they first of all, they pay folks, they pay musicians a lot of money every year so that people can actually have careers, and keep doing that. Like I saw Marcus Shelby there a couple weeks ago, and he's like a local jazz legend, right? Like he's amazing. And I think it's places like the Jazz Center that allow him to do he has a full orchestra. His guys have been gigging with him for decades. Like Jazz Center keeps him in business. But I do think there's a gap. And I think it's something. There's two things that I react to. Like one is what I talked about. It's like kind of nice, like you want something where it's okay not to be, bringing a lot of money, or it costs a lot, and I know they have some free programming, but in general, it's not got that kind of earthier feel to it. But I think the second thing is dancing. That a lot of these jazz clubs supported dancing. They had spaces for it. The music was played in a way where you could dance. The proximity of alcohol and sometimes drugs, but alcohol at least to dance was brought in. And I don't think the Jazz Center does that. And I think we need more spaces that do danceable jazz.
This person says Keys Jazz Bistro in North Beach is very good.
It is good. I agree. Thank you for that.
At this point, you've answered all of our written questions. What question has not been written down that you want to give an answer to?
I like that last question. Well, I mean, my son is 9, his friend is 9. And I do wonder a lot about their San Francisco in 20 or 30 years. And I guess my question is like, what can the city do? Not just politically, you know, not just enacting laws or moving money around, but what can it do culturally to keep a middle class in the city? Because it's too bad if kids grow up in an area where there's no middle class values. And when I think of middle class, I think of people that I grew up around who aren't talking about work a lot, you know, who don't have to think about work all the time to keep their jobs, you know, who kind of really valued hobbies, you know, you saw them outside their houses doing things on the weekend. It just feels like we've become a city where people have to work so much to afford to live here, or there's just been an identity built around work. We don't have people who, just portray like first and foremost, I'm a human being and I have these interests and I have a job. So I guess my question is, I guess culturally, how do we keep some of those values?
I actually really appreciated you bringing up an answer to a question about historic districts and cultural districts. You gave the example of the Mission. Yeah. A lot of people are excited to make sure that Latin food is still available in the Mission, and whether or not stores selling expensive designer handbags should or should not be allowed to operate there. The people that you've talked to, what have they have said for and against on those ideas? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, we did a project for the California Migration Museum 2 years ago in the Mission and worked with a singer who grew up there. La Doña is her stage name. And she's very activist around, you know, she grew up when Starbucks started coming in and she saw gentrification in the neighborhood and she's like, no, keep them out. And I think she'd still say that. I think she'd be on the side of like, let's keep it real. Let's not have $200 handbags. I don't know anybody who needs anything like that. You know, let's just not bring it in here because that's for those gentrifiers that I still feel invaded my space. So I definitely think she'd be on that, like, don't even go there. I guess the people who would want the $200 handbag thing, I think in a way it may be some of the artists I've talked to. It's so hard, you know, to make it as an artist these days. So if there is a space where I can show work, you know, and people can come and pay me a living wage for that work, which I sort of equate with the $200 handbag people. You know, it's one thing to say, okay, we won't sell 200, but does that also mean you won't sell a $1,000 painting that an artist put up there that's trying to really make a living? Because if you sell your painting for $50, that's nice, but you're not going to be able to leave anywhere near the Bay Area for $50. So I do think artists that I know are in this conundrum of, I need to sell my work for a reasonable price to keep living here, because the arts grants they're not making it for them. I hate to I've lived that. It's not making it for people with just arts grants. So I think that's the other side of that coin.
I really appreciate you expanding on that. Jeff, you may want to tell us about upcoming forums that are available, but before we do that, Michael Epstein, I want to thank you so much for your presentation and the answers you gave us today.
Thank you all. That was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, I really thank you, Michael. That was an excellent forum. I just want to redo a couple of announcements. So this coming Saturday, January 18th, I believe it'll be in this room, the BIPOC Committee is having a screening of Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. I believe it starts at 10 or 11. I'm not sure exactly, though, so please check the Flame for the details on that. And there's lunch after that and then a discussion after that. And a week from today, Forum will be back in this room at this time. We have David Bacon speaking about immigration in the Trump administration, so you won't want to miss that. And the week after that, Norm Solomon, Militarism and Imperialism. And on February 2nd, Billy Avery of the Gainesville Women's Health Center talking about reproductive rights. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you back next Sunday.